In this lesson, we're going to be working with another mental ray shader called the car paint shader. Alright, and this car paint shader really pretty much does what it says it does. It's a shader that is able to mimic sort of the multiple layers that we would normally get with any kind of a car paint. Alright, so let's open up our material editor and let's find an empty slot and plug in our car paint shader. So we're going to go to the standard button. Let's plug in this car paint material. Again, this is an MI, a mental images shader. And we'll drag this onto our object. And we'll just take a render at what we have right now. Alright, you can see right away it gives us kind of this glossy, shiny appearance. But if you look very closely, you'll actually notice that there is actually a little bit of color shifting that happens in here as well. Alright, it really becomes especially apparent as we look kind of at this central area, the areas of this object that are facing directly toward us. We have kind of one color, but as we start to move further out to the edges, to these parts of the geometry that are actually pointing out and away from us, we actually have this much darker color around these outer portions. Alright, and that is actually a function of this car paint shader because that is actually part of how car paint behaves. We get kind of these different refractions or these different incidence levels as we look at it from different angles. So up above, kind of in this first bracket, we have the controls that are responsible for the actual color. So we have the base color of this material. So as we start to change it, that's really kind of the underlying color of this whole material. Right? It's not the areas that are necessarily going to be most directly lit or most indirectly lit. It's kind of that area right in between. Now you can see we do still kind of have this odd little red area right in here, and that's actually caused by this little attribute right here, this light facing color. So the areas that are actually going to be more directly aligned to some kind of a direct light source are going to have a certain color. So in this, if we were to give it a maybe much lighter color of blue, there we go. Now we can kind of see that color. Now, in order for this shader to really work correctly, you do need to make sure that you have some sort of a direct light source in your scene, because a lot of what we're seeing right here is actually based on some kind of a direct light source, having these different colors, having this sort of a flake, metal flake in here. All of these things are really based around some kind of a direct illumination source. So we also have this edge color, which really is these outermost edges, the parts that are facing most away from us. So if we really wanted to just see what this is doing, we could take this and maybe make it some kind of a red color just so we can really see what these areas are. Alright, so with this you can really start to see that we can get some very interesting effects off of this. And also we can control the edge bias, which controls really how far away these areas need to be before they start transitioning into this sort of a reddish color. So the lower this value, the further this area is going to have to be before it starts to inherit some kind of a red color. Alright, so with this you can really start to, like I say, some really interesting effects. Maybe things that are not necessarily realistic car paint, but maybe things that kind of glow around the edges or kind of have some kind of a special highlight around the edges. But if you really want to keep this looking like car paint, I would recommend keeping this either black or a very, very dark color of whatever you have set as your base color. Alright, now looking a little bit lower, we have control for flakes. Alright, and this is for if we want to have sort of a paint job that has these metallic flakes in it. Alright, so I'm going to make sure that this is nice and dark because that will make these flakes a little bit easier to see. Now the thing that makes these flakes a little bit tricky is the fact that they are based somewhat on the size of your object. So the exact same values may give you a totally different result if your object is a different size than the one that you actually built this shader to rest upon. So the main attributes that we have to control the size of these flakes is down toward the bottom. That's the flake strength and the flake scale. So the flake scale, pretty much just what it says, the lower this value is, the smaller your flakes are going to be. Okay, so they're right now a little bit difficult to see, so let's try to get it a little bit closer into one of these areas. We can actually get up a little bit better view in here. Alright, so if you look very closely, you can start to see some of these flakes appearing. So let's go back, and let's start to maybe raise this flake scale a little bit higher. Alright, so starting to get a little bit better. Let's maybe try taking this flake exponent, which is the kind of specular contribution. The lower this value, you can see the brighter these flakes start to become, the more pronounced they start to become. So let's start to lower this to maybe something like 10. We may wind up having to bring this back up. And then we also have the flake density, which is basically the overall number of flakes that we have. So very low flake density will give you very, very few speckles. And as we start to bring this up to a higher value, you can see how we get a lot greater concentration of these kind of metal flakes. So let's maybe try taking this density to kind of somewhere around 1.5. We'll see what that does for us. There we go. And now you can really start to see a lot of these flake patterns beginning to appear. And again, this is very heavily influenced by the actual direct light source that you have. So if you have a very small direct light source or a very low intensity direct light source, you may not necessarily be getting these types of effects. So lots and lots of different variables to have to take into account whenever using a shader like this. Alright, and now you can start to see, now that we even drop this scale even a little bit lower, how now we start to get some of these much tinier little metal flake fragments. Alright, so as you can see, lots and lots of different effects that we can begin to achieve with this car paint shader, and it really is a nice shader that can very quickly start to give us some of these kind of layered paint effects. So we have kind of a base color paint, some flake underneath, and then kind of that clear coat on top. Alright, so that's a look at this car paint shader within 3ds Max.